BizTech's Trade Conversation show. Now, our guest for today is Michael Hart. He's the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. The American Chamber of Commerce in China is, or AmCham as it's known, is a non-profit, non-governmental organization representing US companies and individuals doing business in China. Now, to tell us more, Michael, welcome to the show.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Nice to meet you. You summed it up well. I think the thing I would add is AmCham China is trying to help American companies succeed in China. So everything that we do is trying to help our companies do well here, which means that we obviously have to understand what's going on with trade and also what's going on with politics. So quite a few topics.
Now, so could you give us an overview of the size of your organization and also the companies you represent and your key stakeholders?
Okay, so one of the things we like to say is we have sort of nearly 1,000 members. So that's companies who are members of AmCham China. And as you said, we're non-government, non-political. They fund us. And so we're trying to do what's important to them. In terms of company types, we've got people all across the sector. We have large companies, small companies, tech, aviation, consumer goods, everything. And so we have a lot of really rich conversations with them. We like to say that because through our nearly 1,000 companies, we represent really millions of employees in China because, again, very large companies with networks. We have offices in Beijing and then in the Northeast in Dalian, Shenyang, in Tianjin, and Wuhan, but we represent companies all across China.
Now, could you enlighten us in terms of some of the challenges that American companies are facing when operating in China today, given the geopolitical complexity that is the US-China relations?
Right. I mean, first of all, one thing that companies everywhere, of course, face are HR challenges, logistics challenges, just running business challenges and following the rules. So those things exist everywhere. As you said, sometimes the US-China relationship gives that an extra flavor. So, for example, when companies are trying to do business, generally, U.S. companies are very well perceived in terms of brand and quality. Occasionally, we'll go through some ups and downs where U.S. companies will not be the flavor of the week. Similar things with recruiting. We've seen this over the years. For a while, there was a great interest for young graduates to work for Chinese SOEs. The view was that was a good thing. But the truth is, AmCham China, brand USA, has always been pretty good as an employer. And so, again, as tensions go up and down, things change a little bit, but in general, AmCham China companies have been pretty well received in China, both for selling our products and services, but also for employing people, and then also for sort of setting benchmarks in a whole host of things, whether it be new industry standards or green supply chain, et cetera.
Now, let's zoom in on the operating environment in China itself right now. Now, you're currently undergoing tremendous stresses across the supply chain because of all the lockdowns. You also have, because of geopolitical tensions, companies looking at China through a very different lens and looking at China plus strategies. Tell us about this and how this is impacting how your companies are thinking about their business that they're doing in China.
Sure. Let me start by saying, so I've spent more than 20 years in the China market. And years ago, in fact, you can even go back 100 years. So China has always been interesting to people because of the size of the market. So in 1920, there was an author called Carl Crow who wrote a story called 400 million customers. And now it's, of course, 1.4 billion customers. So China has been interesting to the world and specifically to American companies for a long time. AmCham China has been active for over 40 years since the reopening. And so companies have been very, very interested in coming here. You talked about China plus one. So 15 years ago, people said, when China becomes too expensive, people will go to other markets. But the real conversation was, it's very hard to find a market that replaces China in terms of consumers. It's also very hard to replace China in terms of a place that has so many, whether it be just general workers, skilled manufacturing folks, or now even researchers, et cetera. So it's interesting. People have talked about for a while, we want to get into China. How important is China? And so the US business community has built up over decades. So coming to China is a decade-long process. There have been, because of COVID recently, some moves for people not to abandon China, but as you say, maybe a +1. So to reinforce certain parts of their supply chains. And so that has led to some companies starting to look in other locations, generally as a supplement to China. When we talk to the Chinese government, we do try to let them know most of our companies, in fact, none of our companies are anti-China. In some cases, COVID and COVID lockdowns have forced people to make sure that their supply chains are a little bit more resilient. And I don't think that that was China specifically, but because China had COVID later, that became an issue for us.
And Michael, but one of the ground realities of this is actually the following. The supply chains in China are so good, it's really hard to replicate that outside of China. And I use Shenzhen as an example of how it's just so difficult for companies then to do any better than they can in Shenzhen itself.
That's true. It's absolutely true. And one of the things that brought companies to China was the ability to manufacture. And as China became better at manufacturing, of course, it attracted more companies. And so you're right. A couple of China's benefits are very advanced manufacturing and very good supply chains. And I think one of the questions that people have been asking related to COVID is we do want to have a backup supply chain, but the truth is right now China is a significantly cost-effective place to do business.
Now, how is this landscape now shifting because of the geopolitical tensions? Because right now, and since we're zooming in on technology in particular, the Biden administration has just announced that US citizens cannot work in the semiconductor industry or for Chinese companies. How is that going to impact the operating environment for American companies in China, particularly in the tech space?
Right. So, I'll start with one of the key things to keep in mind is the United States and China, that is the largest US trade partner. So sales from and to US and China. So it's huge. What we're seeing right now with, CHIPS Act and then other restrictions in the semiconductor industry is going to impact a really small, but important, but a really small part of the China trade. Generally, what happens is governments will announce a high-level sort of directive, what they're trying to do, and then it's really important to wait and see what the actual specifics are. So one thing AmCham China is doing right now is we're doing a lot of sessions with US government officials and then trade folks to try to help companies to understand, what are those specific restrictions. One of the things that AmCham China encourages the US government to do is, we say, we understand there are national security concerns. We understand there are certain things that you don't want sold to China. Let us know what those are, but be as narrow and as focused as possible so that we can make sure people are abiding by those rules. So right now, we're very much in a, helping our companies study and understand what are the rules. And so it's a little too early to say what the actual implications will be. So, watch this space.
And Michael, sometimes as commercial entities, your members are caught in the crosshairs of diplomatic declines, shall I say, in perceived partnership opportunities. And one of the companies that has probably seen a negative side of this with a very large order going to Airbus is Boeing. How are your companies then navigating this complex relationships if they had, for example, been perhaps victims then of retaliatory measures?
Right. So I can't speak to any specific company, but what I can say is each year when AmCham China benchmarks our company, so we have a couple of policy tools. One of them is a business climate survey where we survey all of our members. And one of the things that you just said has been very clear. Companies increasingly have said that they've been asked to take either a position to make a statement supporting a specific government policy or not to make a statement about a specific government policy. And this could go in either direction. And so what we tell, both the US and the Chinese government is companies are here to do business. And in fact, one of the reasons the US-China relationship has been, relatively stable is because of ongoing exchanges between business people and transactions. And so we try to remind them, what you really don't want to do is you don't want companies to be in the political space. And so we try to sort of say, we stay in our lane. Could you guys stay in your lane? And so we do want American companies to succeed. The US government wants American companies to succeed. And the truth is, in most cases, the Chinese government wants US investment. Chinese consumers want US products. They want, the good brands and the good safety that comes with that. And so we do try to, push back and say, you don't want companies to take a political position. And of course, we don't want our companies punished when politics comes into play.
Now, Michael, at the same time, despite all the geopolitical tensions, we have China's National Development and Reform Commission, NRDC, which is its top economic planner, saying on September 29 that it is actually exploring new ways of attracting more foreign direct investment into China. So obviously, China is still open for business. China wants to attract investment. How are your members seeing that? Because on the other side of the equation, we get the impression from data that we see that many foreign businesses are adopting a holding pattern because a study which you did, AmCham China, showed that 51% of your members either have delayed or decreased investments in China, and that's up from 14%. Tell us about this and what your thoughts are on this.
Sure. So a lot of moving parts there. The first one is Chinese officials at a high level traditionally have been benchmarked on economic growth. So what is GDP doing? Government officials at a lower level have been very specifically benchmarked on how much FDI do they attract. So how much can they bring in? What are the companies going to invest? How many people will they employ? And then how much tax will be generated? So, the Chinese policymakers have been very much focused on FDI for a long, long time. Now, for anybody who's talked to me in the last 6 months, they know the piece that I complain about the most is travel, access to travel. So COVID zero policy and restrictions have made it very difficult for people to travel here. And the message that AmCham China has been trying to send to the Chinese government is, if you want additional investment, you have to allow people to travel, because a normal cycle would be a company is interested in a market. In fact, there's nothing better than getting people to Shanghai or to Beijing to let them see the dynamic market that China is. And they say, we got to be here. We see our competitors here. We need to be here, or we're here. We need to be here in a bigger way. And so that sparks this idea of new investment. And so it's normally a 3 to 5 year process for manufacturing, a little bit shorter for services and retail, but it takes a couple of years to put a plan together, to do investment and then to hire, et cetera. And so what we've told the Chinese government is, when you shut down travel, you shut down the pipeline of new FDI. And we think that the Chinese policymakers are now starting to see this in the economic data. And so all of a sudden they reverse course and say, what can we do? So one of the things they've recently done is they reduced some of the COVID restrictions on quarantine when you come in. It's still not easy. They are reaching out actually to AmCham China to see if we can survey our companies or actually set up meetings so the various Chinese government entities can talk to our member companies specifically and say, where are your pain points? During the COVID lockdowns in Shanghai, many AmCham China companies reported they had very good discussions, very detailed discussions with local either districts or development zones, where they sort of said, what is your specific pain point and how can we help you? Because we want to get you manufacturing again and get the economy producing. So it's no surprise that FDI is the focus and that they're looking for ways to help our companies because, of course, we're an important engine for the Chinese economy.
Now, Michael, I want to highlight something that you mentioned earlier, and it's around talent in China. So how is that vast pool of different levels of talents? It's not just low-cost labor now, but it's really high-end talent as well in terms of engineering. How has that been in terms of your member companies? Have they found it difficult to attract talent? Are they looking at doing more things in China from a talent perspective in order to grow their own timber?
Right. So a couple of things here to look at. One is our annual BCS survey, so the Business Climate Survey. We ask companies, what are your main pain points? For years and years, a couple of the top ones were a lack of qualified employees or a lack of management talent. So there's always been a challenge in China to get sort of the best. And so companies have always found they need to invest in HR systems that do help train people because talent is key. Now, I will say that a lot of US companies and foreign companies have invested in specific sectors and they've actually put R&D here. So for example, with, let's say, electric vehicles, or let's say certain technologies or pharma, China in EVs, I mean, this is where the market is. So if you're not in China, frankly, you're not in EVs. So people have to be here. The other one with tech and pharma, the number of iterations you can do just because of the number of people make this a great place to do research. So again, many AmCham China companies have put R&D centers here, and that's an important part of their global talent base. It's interesting, COVID zero travel restrictions have actually hurt those people because normally those engineers would also travel to labs in Europe or the United States to work with their colleagues. And so COVID restrictions have also hurt that sort of piece of researchers in China. But absolutely, R&D in China is important. And the other thing is that when US companies do well here, they often take that profit and put it back into head office and headquarters as well to do talent work and training in the United States. So it's really important, this global network of talent.
Michael, I want to zoom in on something you just said. It's around investing in R&D in China. Traditionally, a lot of trade rhetoric between the two countries has been around intellectual property and the lack of safeguards around US technology, which the CHIPS Act is also part of. What are your thoughts on this, and how are your members looking at this? Is it different from the ground compared to from a helicopter level, from a policy level?
Right. So one of the things actually that US trade regulators talked to Chinese authorities about years ago when China was entering the WTO, they did stress that IP protection was important because one day China itself would be an innovator. And so what's happened is, of course, there are in all countries, and certainly in China, there will be claims of IP infringement and some challenges from time to time, which we need to highlight and we need to focus on. However, as Chinese companies have moved up the scale, whether it be in EVs or high-speed trains, et cetera, they themselves have IP that they want to protect. And so our companies have reported that IP issues are a lot less critical or painful than they used to be. So that's one thing. Now, going back to something specific to semiconductors, et cetera, the US government has recently said there's certain sectors that are important for national security. Actually, the Chinese have said the same thing. And so there are some pain points around what kind of technology can be sold. There's also some restrictions on the Chinese side about moving data in and out of China. And so in both cases, American companies need to deal with what are the restrictions that US companies place on companies operating here, and the same thing from the Chinese side.
Michael, I want to zoom in now specifically on AmCham and your activities. Now, what's the outlook for the coming year like for AmCham in China in 2023?
Right. Well, so keep in mind that, number one, China and US are each other's largest trading partners. That relationship is the largest we have. So we don't think business is going to go away anytime soon. Again, decades of buildup in investment into China. It will continue to be important for trade both ways. Number two, of course, right now we're at the 20th Party Congress. And so we're about to see, China, how they're going to position themselves for the next 5 years. So we'll be digesting what is the plan that comes out of that. We certainly hope that travel restrictions go down. We're certainly hoping that in addition to travel back and forth, that trade continues to increase. So, we're pretty optimistic that 2023 will be hopefully at least the second half of the year easier to do business than 2022 has been. But our AmCham China companies continue to be active and expect us to be engaged in all of those things. They want to use us for advocacy, both to the Chinese government and the US government. They want us to be involved in putting together business events to help them understand the latest trends. So 2023 is going to be a very active and important year for AmCham China.
Michael, it's been a great conversation, but before we leave, any final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with?
So one of the things that we have said is exchanges are very important. Exchanges of government, of students, of business folks. And one of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is there's been a lack of access to China. And so we do want to make sure that people continue to understand what's going on in China because they can't necessarily come here. So let me thank you and your audience for being interested in China. And I will say, we want to continue to have those conversations, help educate people that, China is a very critical economy in Asia and in the world. It will continue to be. And we're certainly hoping and advocating to everybody we can to get more people-to-people exchanges, whether that be government officials, corporate folks, or students coming back. And that's what we look for in 2023. Hopefully, more folks flying this way and flying back out more easily.
Michael, thank you very much for coming on the show, and thanks for your insights.
Great. Thank you, Brian.
Now, we've been speaking to Michael Hart, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. I'm Brian Fernandez, and this has been BizTech's Trade Conversation Show. This interview will be on our website, www.biztech.asia, as well as our social media platforms. It will also be on our syndication partners, TV stations, radio stations, and websites. Thanks a lot for tuning in.